So I'm Jim Watson, I'm Director of the UK Energy Research Centre. I'm also at UCL here in London. I used to be at Sussex for a long time, so it's really nice to be back, and particularly nice to see the culmination of all the great work the team has done under the Centre for Innovation and Energy Demand. I was reflecting on coming here the time when we were putting the bid together for CED in the early stages. It was a two-stage process. And I remember having to persuade certain colleagues who shall remain nameless that actually it was worth putting in a bid at all to this at the first stage. I'm very glad that in the end we agreed that it was a good idea, because otherwise we wouldn't all be sitting here thinking about all the great work that had been done and debating what to do next. So I've got a few thoughts on innovation and for buildings. I thought I'd say a little bit about where we've come from, because actually there's already been an awful lot of innovation, and that's actually helped us from a climate perspective, and also some consumers through their bills, to get to a slightly better place than they would have been otherwise. A few words about innovation itself, how we might think about it. Probably echoes a lot of things already been said by other speakers. And a few examples just to illustrate that, and a few thoughts to end, particularly on the role of policy, which I agree with many others is absolutely crucial if we're going to make the progress we need to make. I mean, first on taking stock, if you look at what the Committee on Climate Change say, and this is purely from an emissions perspective, but also an energy demand perspective, we have got quite a long way on buildings. So if you go back to 1990, our baseline for emissions, I think we've reduced emissions and energy demand from buildings by about 20% since then, perhaps a bit more. So there's been some quite large progress on that. And a key driver has been innovation and the adoption of energy-efficient technologies, particularly quite low-cost ones like loft insulation, new forms of lighting, and those kind of things, and replacing lots of boilers with condensing boilers. So not particularly radical innovations, but on a mass scale, they've made quite a big difference, both overall to the country, but also to individual homeowners. So their bills would have been higher, even though we're talking today about the rise of the price cap, because energy prices are once again going up. Actually, those bills will probably be much higher for many families had those changes not been made. But I think, as others have said, there's a heck of a long way to go if we really want to realize the potential of innovation to help and also to bring those bills down in a way that's sustainable in the long term. Again, as the Committee on Climate Change has really emphasized, there's a massive policy gap at the moment in this area. I take what Jeremy said, they're spending an awful lot on innovation, but when it comes to creating markets, giving incentives for people to do energy efficiency in homes in various different ways, there is a yawning policy hole at the moment, and it really needs to be addressed quite urgently. Because those incentives aren't there. And one illustration of that, if you look at the data on the number of energy efficient measures that are going into homes every year, it's probably about 10% of the level it was at its peak in 2012. So there's only 10% of the number of measures that are going into homes throughout the UK, as were the case in 2012. It doesn't mean to say we've run out of homes to insulate. There's many homes that we still have left to insulate. It's purely because the incentives are not as strong as they used to be. So when thinking about the future and thinking about where we go next, what are some of the things that I think are important? And these, again, echo things that have already been said. I mean, one is not thinking about innovations one at a time, but thinking about whole house or whole building approaches, combinations of technologies in systems. And I think that echoes some of the points from the transport panel. Very much echo what Joe said and others about people and the social, whether you're thinking about engaging with how people actually want to use energy, how they perceive comfort, what matters to them, but also some segmentation. So echoing what was said, I think, by Debbie earlier about, publics plural, and thinking inside, the different income groups and different ways in which people will engage with energy or transport, and thinking about different incomes and means and so on. One lesson from one of the projects we funded in UKERC called Glider, which is led by Gavin Killip at Oxford, is that actually one of the biggest barriers to change is the construction sector. So in a sense, some of the policy implications are not necessarily just about the energy part of the picture, it's actually about the construction sector. And at the moment, one of their key conclusions was if we're really going to unlock this potential, we need to move away from what they call a fit and forget approach. You go and do a measure and you go away, to the whole house approach, to a more iterative approach to upgrading buildings, a more flexible approach, thinking about outcomes rather than models. And that comes back to the points that others have made about data and how people actually use buildings rather than how a model imagines somebody to use a building. And I think my final framing point really is about supply and demand. So we think about demand, we think about the demand side technologies, but clearly if we're going to decarbonize buildings, you can only go so far with making them energy efficient. We have to think about the fuels and the electricity we use to heat the home, to cool it perhaps in future, all the other services we use, and then that gets us into debates about large-scale infrastructure change, just like it is with transport, thinking about hydrogen and other potential options for doing that. So on to some specific examples which have caught my eye recently that really illustrate some of these dilemmas and difficulties. I mean, one is, I was reading probably a few weeks ago about the first experiment with the Dutch idea called energy sprong. I don't know if you all saw it. It's the idea that you use some very clever technology. You scan a set of buildings, and then you go away, and in a factory you build an extra skin for the building, and you come and install it. And basically it improves the energy efficiency by a significant margin, reduces bills. The only slight problem with it is it comes with a price tag of about £85,000 a house at the moment, which is not necessarily going to make people rush to B&Q and buy one of these. But it made me think, well, actually, if you think of it from an innovation perspective, Energy Sprong, it's been done a bit in the Netherlands and other countries. It's at a very early stage of that sort of deployment phase Jeremy was showing on the diagram. And actually what you need is probably quite a bit of public money as well as private money to get us through that process of learning and scaling up and cost reduction. And potentially, we could see, that kind of solution coming in, I don't know, at the 10th of the cost in a few years' time, if it goes well and and we have cumulative deployment and scaling up and the savings. The kind of thing we've seen in offshore wind, the kind of thing we've seen in PV and in batteries, but applied on the demand side. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one, but the question is, well, will public policymakers and industry be brave enough to spend the money to see whether we can actually make those kind of cost reductions or not? The second is hydrogen. It's been talked about a lot as the ideal solution for buildings in terms of making them zero carbon. The idea is you don't disrupt anybody. So you keep the gas network. The consumer doesn't notice much difference because they can have a hydrogen boiler around the gas boiler. There's a slight problem with where the hydrogen comes from, but that doesn't get mentioned often enough. But there are potentially solutions for that. But the problem with hydrogen is that we really haven't tried it at scale yet. So we've got an imagined solution that people think will be great. We've got other solutions where people have tried them a lot, district heating, heat pumps, etc. Other countries have really cracked those. So I think before we can start getting carried away about hydrogen, we really need to do those large-scale trials. Again, probably towards the right-hand side of Jeremy's diagram. And again, that requires public money. The trouble is, it's going to come with a big price tag again. So you can see a theme coming out here. But if we really want to do innovation, it comes with that price tag attached. The third one is a quite intriguing one, heat as a service. People have mentioned services, and certainly since I started in research, we've been talking about the era when we're driven by services rather than supplying kilowatt hours or therms to people as being the place we want to get to. But we've been talking about it a lot and not really making much progress towards it, except in the commercial sector. So there's a heat as a service trial. Bristol Energy have just started, supported by the Energy Systems Catapult. And this idea that people will pay for a level of thermal comfort in their home, in their building, and that's a different business model. And ideally, that might then pull through an incentive for efficiency, to sell them low-carbon technologies, etc. I think it's intriguing. Who knows whether it will work? But I think one of the things which might determine whether it worked or not is whether it's really able to make that model work within the current market and regulatory framework, which still encourages most energy suppliers to do the pilot high, sell it as expensive as they can make it sort of model. So kilowatt hours is what they deal in. And until that market and rules of the game change, I think it's very hard for companies to make money using a service model. So there's a question there. So what are the implications of this? Well, first, policy is crucial. That's a kind of obvious conclusion. I think if you're going to do innovation properly, you need to do all the things Jeremy's shown that government is doing. You need to do some of the ambitious industrial strategy challenge fund trials at a larger scale. You probably have to spend more money nearer to market. So government has an absolutely key role in creating markets, not just doing R&D. And if it doesn't do the market creation, particularly around buildings, on energy efficiency, hydrogen, whatever it happens to be, the risk is a lot of these innovations won't happen at scale and you won't get those cost reductions. I think there's also a very, very important and thorny issue about inspection and monitoring and looking at the outcomes of efficiency in buildings and making sure they perform once you add the people and the way that in which they behave in practice. And that's something that we're very, very weak on in this country, and particularly even when we're building new homes, which are supposed to be much better than the ones most of us live in right now. So I think standards and enforcement. And I think I'd just end by emphasizing that point about engaging people, not just as consumers, but as citizens, because actually some of this stuff is going to require larger systemic change. I mean, it's great to see that BEIS is starting to do some public engagement work around different pathways to heat, for example. So I think that's important, just to sensitize people to, well, actually it's not just a case of things happening in your home, but actually they may require upstream changes to the way in which energy gets from wherever it's generated all the way to the home to heat it, cool it, or whatever. So engaging people in their full diversity, I think, as I think Debbie said, is really, really important too. I'll leave it there. Thank you.